And we have the opportunity now to ask you some questions in conversation with Dorte. You have been working on patterns of migration in your space, and Dorte on Exile, so it somehow lends itself to a conversation between the three of us. And Sumayaa, if I can pick up on what we just saw in your presentation, I saw in one slide that you wrote that architecture has been in the past about defining and controlling space. Your work is about deconstructing perspective. So how do you revisit migration through the history of architecture?
Thanks so much for the question, and it's such an honor to be in conversation with both of you. I think given this phenomenal platform and the incredible questions and reflections that we've been hearing, I think absolutely you're right. And especially coming from my context, I'm from Johannesburg, I'm based in Johannesburg. I have an awareness, or a specific architectural awareness around how segregated the city is and how much it was planned for segregation. And so I think that having that understanding of how segregated the city is through architecture, that architecture's become weaponized almost in how it separates people and how it's used in the urban landscape. Johannesburg, as most South African cities was unequal by design from the beginning. And I think that it's an extreme example of conditions that we find in many other cities as well. But I think understanding that condition, that architecture has the power to segregate, also makes us realize that it is a force for the opposite, that it's also a force to bring people together, and that there's so much power in that. And just thinking through what you said about how people move and migrate, I think that there are many ways of being, and that there are so many forms of living and of life that lend themselves to movement, to flux, to thinking about how people come together through ritual, through community, and so on. And architecture also holds space for all of those functions as well. It's just that for the most part, I think so much of our built fabric has become formalized around a particular worldview, or to a degree that we've forgotten that. And so a big part of what my practice is advocating for is finding ways to learn from those different ways of being, and finding ways to recenter architecture around things that are much more open, or ways of being that are much more about togetherness and gathering than they are about separating.
Dorte, I see you nodding your head there. How did you translate the sense of separation, exile, segregation, to use the word that Sumayaa did, into a space? I'll ask you to use your microphone, thanks.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the presentation. I think it was very beautiful, very poetic, and I think it's almost like an applied research that we see here, going deep into how architecture affects the daily life of people. And I totally agree that architecture has the power to segregate, but also to bring people together. And I think that's one of the probably most important understandings is that every time we do architecture, every time we do build, we consciously or unconsciously are either dividing or privatizing or opening up for a more public understanding of the buildings. And I think the Exile Museum is a very, very specific building and a very specific site with a very specific history. So I think that's, to me, that is in a way just trying to understand that situation here, but to open that up and to discuss much more about how architecture can include and how you can work with architecture as a way of including in cities. I think that's an important discussion.
Sumayaa, you built your structure around the concept of community, as you just said. What is a community in a metropolis? I mean, you're looking at this through the perspective of London, but also Joburg.
Yeah, I think even in my own architectural practice, it's a term that I find quite contentious to use, because there are so many different communities, and I think that we often imagine the word community as a kind of overarching benevolent term, but communities like many dynamic structures and ecologies, also have lots of tensions and pluralities within them. So that's a really great question that you're asking, what is a community? I think in the case of the pavilion structure, I worked with thinking about many different histories of migrations, and then I looked in particular at spaces that were important in moments of migration, in bringing people together. So in the ways that people found ways to establish belonging and the beginnings of community in a new city. For example, some of the first mosques, African churches, synagogues, temples, but then also markets that hold ingredients that are important to people's recipes, and informal gatherings on the street where people came together for protest or for carnival or to celebrate a cultural festivity and so on. And I worked with those moments as moments of community, and then worked with trying to interpret and translate the architectural gestures of gathering in those, and thinking about how architecture was facilitating people to come together, whether it was through the provision of a broad enough sidewalk space or a set of structures that people could sit on or gather at. So I think that I don't know that I have an answer to the question, what is community, because there are, of course, many, but I think that the way that I'm working with the term is thinking about a group of people who gather to identify around some common ground or for some common purpose. And of course, I think it's important to acknowledge that there are many different forms of community and many different forms of public.
Coming together has been made more difficult, as we know, over the last year and a half. So, Dorte, I'd like to ask you, how have the events of the last year and a half changed your vision and the original vision you had for the museum, and also maybe more broadly in your work?
Well, I'm kind of a skeptic I'm kind of skeptic when we discuss cities and discuss whether the gathering places is not necessary anymore, or whether we should. I do think that the pandemic has somehow showed us how important public space actually is, and how we need to be much more careful in shaping public space and to make it inclusive, but not necessarily to program it or to brief it as a space for a certain function, but actually to, I think what Sumayaa is saying about understanding the means that you can use to actually bring people together, or just to make public space livable. So I think for the Exile Museum, what we do is to open up the roof terrace and to make a kind of open park up there. And then, of course, that's a public space. We always try to do that every time we do a building, is to say, can we create some kind of public space which is outside the payment zone or the border. But I think the cities you need to be much more aware now that the cities we create really needs not just space, but public space and of course green space. I was just in Athens recently, and which is one of the cities in Europe that has the least public space, and on top of that, it is a really hot city too. And I think that's kind of almost at a breaking point, you could say. And I think there's lots of cities around the world that really is reaching that edge because public space is kind of is totally lacking. Yeah.
Sumayaa, I'd put the same question to you and add, I read that you said that you believe the racial justice protests that swept the world could make people more receptive to your work as well. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, I just also want to agree with what Dorte is saying. I think that I absolutely believe in the power of architecture, and I think, if anything, this time that we've had in isolation and with screens, of course, it's enabled so much that we can hold on to, but I think, if anything, for me, it's really heightened the power of physical space and the need for us to think about spaces differently and more equitably. What I meant by that statement is, I think that the intent and the design that I had for this project has been the same before and after COVID, and during COVID as well. But I think that there are many moments that we've had in the last year, the pandemic being one of them, that heightened for so many people the inequities in cities. And also the rupture that we had around the BLM movement, questions around how institutions are functioning and what their roles are in cities. All of those things, I think, it kind of sharpened and amplified for me the intent of the project. And I hope that because we're becoming more awake and alive to these issues, that it is an opportunity for these messages embedded within the project about how we can honor voices of difference and how we can also work to evolve community and belonging for people and start to include them into our architectural lexicon. I hope that that can be heard more deeply, because we're able to see now very viscerally the effects of unequal city planning and unjust city making as well.
Embedded in your practice, Dorte, just to pick up on what Sumayaa was just saying, you are focusing, you said the Exile Museum obviously is a very specific project with a specific goal. You're focusing on stories of exile also in the lead up to the Second World War. How do you connect that in a space to current stories of exile and migration visually?
I think that we're trying to avoid symbolism, I think, in some ways, and what we try to do is to create a sensuous experience, which is not intellectual. It's much more about experiencing with your body the uncertainty and the spatial experience of being not belonging or not having a home. And I think it's what Sumayaa is showing is also that home can be many things. It can be tiny constructions around you, but to have the physical experience of being homeless, I think is very different than not having a home. So that's what we try to do with the architecture, but with avoiding kind of a symbolic way of understanding exile.
You said in your presentation you hope to create a space for some magical elements and unexpected elements as well. What would those be?
Well, I think with the Exile Museum, there's kind of a balance between creating the uncertainty, the spatial uncertainty, and at the same time actually creating a useful public space. So we work very much with the invitation to invite people inside and to actually have the space that is the exterior space, which is a public space, to be part of the building. So there's a kind of seamless transition between interior and exterior and so forth. But I don't think it's so much present in this building as much as it is in some of our other buildings, because there's this kind of emotional loaded story about this place. So this is where we've been focusing. Yeah.
And Sumayaa, in the deconstructed spaces that are part of your pavilion, how do you bring in people who are beyond the communities, as contested as that word is, as we said, beyond the communities that are addressed by these spaces, that you have included by your research and the work that you put into them?
So on the one hand, there are these fragments of the pavilion that are located in community arts institutions that have been integral to the formation of the pavilion. So I think out of a list of about 52 places that I've worked with drawing on and translating the generosity of, we've developed more meaningful relationships with 4 of those places, and there are fragments of the pavilion located in these neighborhoods, which are now becoming sustained collaborations, hopefully, between myself, the Serpentine, and these partner institutions, and then by extension, of course, all of the neighborhoods and the actors involved in those spaces as well. One of them, for example, embarking in Dagenham, which builds on an existing relationship that the Serpentine has had with the municipality over the last 10 years, is going to become a hub for a radio station, which is launching in September. And there are many, in the same way the other three also function similarly. But I've also had the opportunity to, over this last year, set up a fellowship program with the Serpentine called Support Structures for Support Structures, which is working to support artists at the intersection of art and social justice, art and ecology, and art and climate change. And more than just through funding, we're also looking to develop a network between and among these artists and to mobilize resources within the Serpentine, like access to mentorships and access to skills development. And I think my hope is that through this, that we really start to build and generate networks and bodies of knowledge that are coming from places of difference in the arts. And so I think that, to answer your question, we need to be able to function on many different levels in the realm of physical architecture, but also I think reflecting on this moment of the pandemic and so on, we also need to think about how intangible structures are perpetuated in physical structures more deeply, and how we as architects can start to intervene in all of those realms.
What do you think of that, Dorte? How intangible structures can be made into tangible structures in architecture?
I don't understand the question. Could you repeat it?
Well, Sumayaa was just saying, bringing intangible structures into your tangible work as an architect. How do you reflect that in your work when you go about your process of design? Abstract thoughts, or perhaps that you bring then into your concrete structure. It's a difficult one. I think Sumayaa just touched on it. Maybe you want to elaborate on it, Sumayaa.
Well, I mean, I think to use negative examples, so much of our politics perpetuates in physical space. Securitization, privatization, the increased amount of enclaves that we have, in Johannesburg, the increasing amount of walls and fences that we have, those are intangible forces that then have tangible form. And in that way, I think any form of architecture also is a perpetuation of a certain kind of politics, whether we are conscious of it or not conscious. And so when I'm talking, for example, about this fellowship program, it's also a recognition that, you know, architecture is also involved in politics, and we need to think about institutional structures and how architecture is a crystallization of those. And I think as part of that project, thinking about how we practice as architects, how we work together, how we collaborate, who we collaborate with, whose voices are included in our practice, and how that shifts and changes practice is important.
Well, I can only agree. and I think that architecture is a political statement, no matter whether you recognize it or not. And as you just stated, that you also have the way you work and in which collaborations you work is definitely also a statement. So I think there's both a statement in the way when you work, you think of the impact that you actually have on the society around you, on the immediate society, of course, but also on a larger scale. And I think that's very much part of being aware of what you do and who you work with. Yeah. And
I should ask before we wrap up our dialogue, when can we see the Exile Museum here in Berlin in person? Well,
hopefully in a short while. Well, hopefully in the right, about 2 years. We're hoping 2 to 3. Yeah.
Looking forward to it. Sumayaa, Dorte, thank you very much both for your presentations and your time.
Thank you.